Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series, Rendezvous with Death, where we looked at different people who went to volunteer to fight in World War I from the United States years before America launched the Expeditionary Forces. In the previous episode, we looked at what these people were doing during the Belle Epoque, the period from 1871 to 1914. Now we're going to see what happens when World War I itself erupts. Those living during the Belle Epoque had a vague unease over the European political situation, like being a villager or a farmer on the edge of a dormant but smoking volcano. Ever since Germany had fought a series of wars to achieve unification in the previous generation, the existing great power balance in Europe had been disturbed by the newcomer's sense of entitlement. The European nations were lined up like dominoes, waiting only for something or someone to start the chain reaction of general European war, or so the conventional wisdom at the time held it. The assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife on June 28, 1914, triggered this event, and it would alter Europe forever. Before it was all over, 4 empires would be destroyed, the world's first communist state would be created, and the United States would emerge as a great power. France was presented with an ultimatum by its arch-rival on August 2nd. Stand down or face war with the Kaiser's army. The fact that they had been preparing for this moment for over 40 years did little to soften the impact of what was about to happen. France was going to war. All of Paris was electric and terrified. In the midst of these panicked hours, the American expatriate community was as swept along by events as their hosts. There was a general sense that France's fight was their fight too. Within days of Germany's formal declaration of war, a group of American men sought the counsel of U.S. Ambassador Myron Herrick to determine the legality of joining the French army. Herrick explained to them that it would be impossible to do so and retain their U.S. citizenship. Fortunately, France had a curious institution known as the Légion étrangère, the French Foreign Legion, formed in 1831 to help subdue Algerian insurgents. It actively recruited foreigners to fight for France. It asked only that its members swore to serve with faithfulness and honor, and to follow the corps wherever the government may wish to send it. No formal oath of allegiance to France was necessary. For its part, the giant French military machine appreciated the Americans' keen desire to help, but it had far larger concerns as plans formulated and tweaked for more than a generation were put into effect. The innocuous-sounding Plan 17 called for an enormous French offensive east into the lands taken by Germany in 1871, Alsace and Lorraine, then on to the Rhine and beyond. The French High Command, despite ample evidence of the contrary from the Boer War and the Balkan Wars earlier in the century, insisted that the ferocity of the bayonet would trump the machine gun and high explosive. Relying on the combination of, guts, they expected to sweep the German army before then in an attack to excess. Millions of young Frenchmen mustered onto village greens and in town and city squares, their shoes clattering on ancient cobblestone streets, and they boarded railway cars long diverted for just this purpose and traveled through a green and golden countryside towards the German frontier. For Alan Seeger and his circle of friends in Paris, these days were filled with a high degree of pathos and an otherworldly detachment from the events screaming at them from the headlines of the city's dailies. Life went on. On the day after Serbia failed to agree to all the terms of Austria-Hungary's ultimatum, Belgian cyclist Philippe Thys completed the final stage of the Tour de France. He entered Paris after a 210-mile bike ride from the port of Dunkirk on the English Channel, claiming his second consecutive title. The heated discussions in the cafes continued far into the evenings, with an urgency now, as radical socialists and anarchists argued against those in support of heeding the nation's call to arms. In the end, there were far more of the latter, including many socialists, and the tables began to empty, as party trumped ideology, and what would become known as the sacred union between French citizens and the state, though some actually did refuse to take part in the war. The French authorities had actually anticipated a 5 to 13% refusal rate for call to arms. In fact, the rate was actually only 1.5%. For his part, Pablo Picasso, a citizen of Paris for 14 years, chose to stay in the city, but stayed out of the fight. His fellow Cubist, Georges Braque, volunteered. In the meantime, the Americans in Paris were forced to wait until August 21st to formally enlist. In the intervening weeks, they held daily drill under Charles Sweeney, West Point class of 1904, in the courtyard of the Palais Royal in the 1st District. Curious crowds of onlookers watched admiringly as they earnestly adopted a military posture and civilian dress. The initial nucleus of men that had sought out Ambassador Herrick had grown daily with new arrivals from elsewhere in France and from the United States itself. Among these were the brothers Paul and Kiffin Rockwell, most recently of West Peachtree Street, Atlanta, Georgia. As news of the war blared across the headlines of the city's newspapers, the Rockwells felt first outraged and then compelled to join France in its coming fight. Their work at the Massingale Advertising Agency, which had seemed to hold some promise, now appeared boring at best. They contacted the French consulate in New Orleans and offered their services for the war effort, caught a train to New York, and booked passage aboard the liner St. Paul for Europe. In short order, they reached France. It was a great adventure that had been calling Kiffin Rockwell all his life. Adventure had little to do with what drew another American to Paris that summer. Jack Bowe, the Spanish-American war veteran who is now a 45-year-old father of 4 and ex-mayor of Canby, Minnesota, was a man with a deep sense of right and wrong. Bowe saw the coming struggle as one between France, a people with an army, as he described it, and Germany, as he described, an army with a people. As such, this fight was a fight in defense of free peoples everywhere and their most cherished values. It was his fight. For the varied assortment of Americans still frequenting their old haunts, there was a general sense of gratitude to the city that had served as both inspiration and playground. They owed it to the Parisians, they felt. Thus, it was a mix of idealism, duty, and sentimentality that spurred their efforts to get into the fight against Germany. Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars and a number of like-minded expatriates published a proclamation in the Paris papers that captured this mood perfectly. The hour is grave. Every man worthy of the name should act today, should forbid himself to remain inactive in the midst of the most formidable conflagration history has ever enregistered. Any hesitation would be a crime. Not words, actions. Aspiring architect and artist Victor Chapman made his way to England to first consult with his father, John J. Chapman. He had left France when news of mobilization reached Paris. This was a difficult encounter, with the father trying to be both considerate of his son's wishes, while at the same time encouraging him to reconsider his decision to join a fight that was not his own. He later recounted his meeting with his determined son. Victor had been prowling about in a lonely way for 24 hours, he said, and he now, with a sort of hangdog humility, suggested he was going to enlist. I reasoned with him. With that stupidity, which is the natural gift of parents, I probed his conscience and suggested that perhaps it was merely a random desire to see life and get rid of his serious duties that led him to the idea of enlistment. But my own idea was that I was only preventing the lad from doing something which was not fundamentally his duty. Within a week, he was in France. Alan Seeger had also been in England visiting with his father just before the outbreak of the war. He intended to find a publisher there for his first volume of poems, but it was not to be. Seeger bid his father farewell on July 25th and was back on the continent soon thereafter, in Bruges, Belgium, placing his manuscript with a printer in a country that was about to be overrun by the German army. The streets of Paris were charged with news of war, but the tables in his favorite cafe were deserted. But for the proprietor, he said, a querulous old man named Léon Barrou. He told Alan that most of his French customers had been called off to the color, while the foreigners among them had joined La Légion. Seeger sprinted down the streets, eager to join his countrymen playing soldier at the Palais Royal. He arrived in time to be chewed out by Charles Sweeney for failing to fall in when directed to do so, and it made little difference to Sweeney that Seeger had no idea what falling in meant. The group of men that eventually coalesced around daily drill in the courtyard of the Palais Royal was nothing if not diverse. A well-meaning but motley collection of Ivy Leaguers, tramps, and adventurers motivated by the same overriding passion to defend France and, to them, by extension, civilization, in her hour of greatest need. Along with Kiffin and Paul Rockwell, prizefighter Bob Scanlon, and Brooklyn tough kid Herman Chadoff, Alan Seeger was joined by Harvard classmate David King, Yale dropout turned stunt pilot William Thaw, and professional race car driver Bob Sorbonne. Veteran Edward Morley, who, like Jack Bowe, had fought in the Philippines, also joined them. He claimed to have seen fighting in the Mexican Revolution as well. New Yorker and Columbia University graduate Dennis Dowd was rumored to have been disappointed in love and was making good on his promise to a young lady to whom he had proposed that he would go to France to fight in the war if she refused him. Edgar Beligny of New Orleans, James Bach of St. Louis, Fred Zinn of Battle Creek, Michigan, and San Franciscans Charles Hoffaker and Jack Casey, another artist, were there too, as were Harvard graduate Edward Mandell Stone, taxicab driver Bert Hall, jeweler's engraver Charles Trinkard of Ozone Park, New York, and Ferdinand Capdeville, the son of a New York fencing master. Perhaps the most interesting of the lot was one René Felizot of Chicago by way of Africa. Felizot had lived the kind of life that was the stuff of boys' dime novels. After running away from home in the Midwest at age 13, he worked as a cabin boy on a Mississippi riverboat, then later worked his way across the Atlantic. Eventually, he found his calling as a big game hunter in Africa. He dealt in elephant tusks and gained wide renown in the Lake Chad region for his very specific set of skills. Felizot's father was a Frenchman. On holiday in France in July 1914, he too was swept up in the desire to aid France. But he would do so as an American, representing the country of his birth. By the end of the third week in August, most of the original contingent of Americans was in place. There were fewer than 50 of them, a drop in the bucket of France's potential military strength, but collectively they possessed great symbolic significance. The foreign fighters, not just Americans, but Greeks, Russians, Jews, Armenians, Alsatians, Danes, Colombians, Peruvians, Italians, and Spaniards, demonstrated to the wider world that France's cause was just and universal. The American volunteers, in particular, carried an added significance in that their home country was an industrial giant and potentially potent military power as well. If their commitment could sway American public opinion, then perhaps the U.S. government could eventually be convinced to abandon its stated policy of strict neutrality. On August 21st, the Americans officially signed their enlistment papers and were granted 3 days to get their affairs in order before embarking. For Alan Seeger, this decision sparkled with a clarity rare in life. He said, "I have talked with so many of the young volunteers here. Their case is little known, even by the French, yet altogether interesting and appealing. They are foreigners on whom the outbreak of war laid no formal compulsion. But they stood on the boot, in springtime perhaps, as Julian and Louise stood, and looked out over the myriad twinkling lights of the great city Paris, mystic, maternal, personified, to whom they owed the happiest moments of their lives. Paris was in danger. Were they not under a moral obligation, no less binding than that by which their comrades were bound legally, to put their breasts between her and destruction? Without renouncing their nationality, they had chosen to make their homes here beyond another city in the world. Did not the benefits and blessings they had received point them a duty their heart and conscience could not deny? And on a deeper level, the war was calling Seeger and his comrades to defend one side in an ancient feud in modern form. According to this historical interpretation, the Allied side that they were joining was a pan-Latin front, a classical civilization united against the German barbarians, if they were looking at things from a Roman perspective, which some romantics were. As art historian Kenneth Silver has explained, in the larger historical context for those living in Paris in 1914, the very people who invaded France are the same ones who sacked Rome, and they were now coming to sack Paris. The day after the Americans officially enlisted, the French army met the enemy in the climax of what would come to be known as the Battle of the Frontiers. As the name suggests, the fighting was concentrated along the border between the French Republic and the German Empire. From the Ardennes forest in the north to Mulhouse in the south, French soldiers attacked the Germans, trusting in their élan, their bravery, and their bayonets to sweep their longtime foe before them. But in the age of modern warfare, rapid-firing machine guns and powerful and accurate artillery fire more than offset those perceived strengths. On the single day, August 22, 1914, the French army lost approximately 27,000 soldiers. This figure doesn't reflect French soldiers who were wounded or taken prisoner, only those who lost their lives. To place this figure in some historical context, the single deadliest day in U.S. military history was September 17, 1862, when both the Union and Confederate forces combined lost a total of 3,654 killed in the Battle of Antietam. So you can't imagine what France lost on that terrible day. It was certainly more than a battle. As Paris reeled under the news of the disaster, it looked anxiously to the north where the German general Alexander von Kluck had pushed through Belgium and now looked to descend on that city. Would the French cause be lost before the American volunteers could even fire a shot? This wasn't as preposterous a question as it might seem. But the bad news did little to dim the ardor of the Americans. When the day scheduled for their departure arrived, they were